Hello again, everybody. My name is Bilal Askaryar. I'm the Director of Communications at the Acacia Center for Justice. The Acacia Center for Justice is a relatively new organization that is nationwide, and we fight really for the right of people to remain in their communities through legal defense for immigrants who are in detention or are facing deportation. Today's conversation is about the intersection of anti-Blackness and our criminal immigration system. And this is a topic that can't be talked about enough, given the state of our current immigration system. And I'm excited to hear from the thought leaders on this panel. And I also just want to say, I recognize that we're having this conversation during Black History Month, and also while there is a plausible genocide happening in Palestine. These systems are directly linked, and the question of who gets to remain on a land is really pertinent today. So thank you everyone for joining, and I want to pass it over to Professor Jaya Ramji-Nogales. Professor Ramji-Nogales is Associate Dean for Research at the I. Herman Stern Research Professor at Temple Law School, where she teaches refugee law and policy and supervises the Temple Law Asylum Project. Her recent scholarly works examine the intersection of race, immigration law, and national security, assess refugee law under the Trump administration, including The End of Asylum, co-authored with Professors Andrew Schoenholtz and Philip Schrag, and Nationality Bans, co-authored with Professor Tali Kritzman-Amir, and analyzed law and policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic, including migration in the time of COVID-19, comparative law and policy responses. Her prior publications have explored the concept of global migration law, uncovered the role of international law in constructing migration emergencies, and critiqued human rights law as insufficiently attentive to the interests of undocumented migrants. And we're also really lucky and privileged to have her serving as a trustee at the Acacia Center for Justice. So thank you so much, Professor. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bilal. It's really an honor to participate in this crucially important panel to celebrate the launch of Modern Migrations, Black Interrogations, Revisioning Migrants and Mobilities Through the Critique of Anti-Blackness. And I will say, I don't know how well you can see that with my blurred screen, but in addition to being a wonderful book, it's a really beautiful book. And I recommend that people buy it and read it. A huge thank you to the co-editors and to all of the panelists for being here today, and to the 193 participants, which I think shows the really crying need for this particular book to recognize the gaps that it discusses. I do want to start, though, by recognizing and acknowledging that the land on which I sit stands on the indigenous territory known as Lenapehoking, the traditional homelands of the Lenape, also called the Lenni Lenape. I honor the Lenni Lenape people still present in Lenapehoking and those who continue to return to their land. I honor the tenacity of the people who have stood tall, resisted genocide, and continue to practice their culture. I'd also like to say a thank you to the Acacia Center for Justice, Bilal Askaryar, among others, for hosting this event. Acacia, as Bilal mentioned, is a growing nonprofit that focuses on enabling meaningful access to justice for immigrants at risk of deportation or detention so that they can remain within their communities, which is an important theme of the book. Acacia's work builds, strengthens, and expands programs to offer legal representation to immigrant adults and children nationwide. This particular panel, as Bilal mentioned, is time to honor Black History Month, which is obviously an incredibly important month, but always gives me pause. It's obviously important to honor, to recognize the contributions of African Americans to the history of this nation, but Blackness and anti-Blackness should be central to all discussions of US history, but that is still contested, as we've seen over the furor around AP African American history, which should actually just be AP US history. So that really takes me to this excellent book, because as the introduction to the book explains, Blackness should be the starting point for any study of mobility. And as they explain, Blackness is inextricably bound up with the ruptures that create the radically depersonalized, placeless condition. So I'm quoting the introduction liberally there. I don't want to preempt the editor's contribution to this panel, but I just want to raise some important themes that we'll discuss in the Q&A, along with questions that I'm looking forward to from the audience. Perhaps most crucially, and I think this is what we're seeing in the now 203 folks who have joined us, the book opens up silence around the question of Blackness and migration. It questions the invisibility of anti-Black violence, raising themes of social death and dehumanization and non-humanity. It discusses anti-Blackness as distinct from colonialism and neocolonialism, all intersecting forms of oppression, but each with their own manifestations. And it really points us to the failure to discuss Blackness in scholarship and advocacy around migration. Now, this is, of course, starting to change. I understand there's a hearing this Thursday in Haitian Bridge Alliance versus Biden. Guerline may discuss that when she joins us. That case is about the expulsion of Haitians in Del Rio, Texas in September 2021, and the ongoing policy that is known as the Haitian deterrence policy. And even at the international level, the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and the Committee on Migrant Workers are working on a general comment on anti-Blackness and migration. So this is bubbling up. It's a long overdue conversation. The key point, one of the many key points, I suppose, that I would take away from the book is that we have to situate borders and bordering within anti-Blackness. And this helps us to understand that freedom of movement presupposes Black captivity. One of the crucial points the book makes, and this is what I think Bilal mentioned too in his introduction, is that the freedom to remain, the freedom to stay within one's community is often overlooked. And when we look at Black mobility, we understand Black mobility as uprootedness. And this reconceptualizing of how we think about mobility helps us to understand all borders. It helps us to understand what is happening in Gaza right now, right? That the idea that what many people want is the freedom to stay safely within their community, and they are forced to move. And then once they move, they are not given a place where they can remain. The book really resists what has been labeled elsewhere the mobility bias, and it also resists the linear progress narrative of migration, that migration is somehow a step towards this liberal future, and shakes up that question in really important ways that enable us to keep our eyes on global structural injustice, on big picture problems, on big picture solutions. And we just have an incredible group of speakers to engage with these questions. They all have very long and impressive bios, which I'm not going to do justice to, but let me just start by introducing them in the order in which they will speak. So I'll start with the co-editors of the volume. First, Dr. Jamela Gao, who is the Rasuli Lewis Assistant Professor of Sociology at Bowdoin College, where she teaches an impressive array of courses on race and ethnicity, Black culture and activism, migration and policing, borders and illegality, globalization and culture. And her research also focuses on the connections and intersections between migration and immigration, race and Blackness for Black migrants. She explores how Caribbean migrants navigate racial and ethnic identity, inclusion and exclusion, and she has published extensively on these topics. Our other co-editor, Dr. Philip Kretsedemas, will speak next. He is currently the Managing Director of Research Evaluation and Data Analytics at Acacia Center for Justice. Previously, before joining Acacia, he was a professor of sociology at the University of Massachusetts at Boston, with a specialization in the critical analysis of immigration enforcement and the rights of migrants and asylum seekers. He's co-edited several books. And before his career at UMass, he was Policy and Development Director for the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild. Next, we'll have Dr. Regine Jackson, who is a professor of sociology and dean of the Humanities, Social Science, Media, and Arts Division at Morehouse College. Before coming to Morehouse, she was assistant vice president for diversity, equity, and inclusion at Agnes Scott College, where she had many faculty leadership roles. Her undergraduate degree is from Brown and a master's and PhD from the University of Michigan. She's an active scholar in the areas of Haitian migration and diaspora, race and ethnicity, American immigration, spatial inequality, and global learning. She has published a book entitled Geographies of the Haitian Diaspora and has another on a similar topic underway. And she's received many impressive grants from the American Sociological Association, the Ford Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, among others. Our next speaker is Guerline Jozef, who I think will be joining us soon. Guerline is always on the front lines. We are fortunate to have her. She is a leading human rights advocate and the co-founder and executive director of Haitian Bridged Alliance, a US-based nonprofit that advocates for fair and humane immigration policies. And it really has been out front on these issues. It has a particular focus on Black immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa, the Haitian community, women and girls, LGBTQA+ individuals. And she's a co-founder of the Black Immigrants Bail Fund and the Cameroon Advocacy Network. She was named one of Politico's 2021 40 Most Influential Peoples on Race, Politics, and Policies, and she's won many awards, including the Robert F. Kennedy Human Rights Award and the Arthur C. Helton Human Rights Award from the American Immigration Lawyers Association. We will, as if that weren't enough, we will next have Haddy Gassama, who's the director of policy and advocacy for the UndocuBlack network. She is from the Gambia. She immigrated to the US with her family as an asylum seeker, and her career has focused on the intersection of human rights law and immigration law and policy. Previously, she worked at the National Immigration Justice Center, where she advocated for policies enhancing congressional oversight of the immigration policy and advocacy movement. And finally, last but not least, we'll hear from Janay Cauthen, who is a second-generation Jamaican American who's made New York City her home and her community. And she has been involved with Families for Freedom since 2005, when her husband was detained by ICE, starting as an intern, and she's now the executive director of the organization's staff and board. She has faced personally, she has lived experience with many immigration-related challenges, including losing her former husband to deportation in 2018 during the Trump administration. Despite those challenges, she has always worked hard to support and empower others facing similar issues on the basis of her belief in equality. And she was able to help her former spouse receive a pardon in 2021 so he could be eligible to return to the US and be reunited with their children. And she's also the co-founder of New York's Sanctuary Movements, which provide direct services to immigrant families caught up in the unjust deportation and detention system. So what's going to happen next is each of these wonderful panelists will take about 5 minutes to offer some opening remarks. Then I will offer questions for discussion, and we're really excited to hear from all of you. So after that, we'll open up to questions from participants. So I will hand it over to Dr. Gell to get started.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here, and I'll just give some brief opening remarks and turn it over, of course, to my fellow panelists. So good afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Dr. Jamela Gao, and I'm an assistant professor of sociology at Bowdoin College, where I teach and research on immigration, race, Blackness, and the Caribbean. And I'm just really excited to be here today to talk about the book, Modern Migrations, Black Interrogations, and importantly, hear from those on the ground, as we heard very briefly, addressing the issue of the status of Black immigration to the United States. In writing for this book, one thing that I keep in mind is the way Black immigrants are very uniquely targeted in ways different from other non-white migrants in the immigration system. We can think about, for example, the notion of crimmigration, which is a term created by immigration and legal scholars to describe this convergence of the criminal justice and immigration system for the deeper policing of migrants today. However, it should better account for the fact that Black migrants have always suffered from policies that criminalize them specifically as Black alongside their immigrant status. Further, we can think about the history of immigration and foreign policy that has been directed against those migrants whose nations and peoples are negatively racialized as Black and targeted as such. This twin process is something different from the more common discussion among scholars and policymakers on the plight of non-white migrants. And something I hope that we can do in this conversation is bring to light these very unique factors which distinguish Black migrants from other groups. However, I also want us to think too about how their dual status as Black and migrant can serve as these opportunities for linkages between groups that focus on anti-Blackness, such as the more visible Black Lives Matter, as well as pro-immigrant groups which focus on the unique struggles that non-citizens face. In doing so, we can better address the needs and concerns of all migrants impacted by racialized immigration policies and speak to the deep history of anti-Blackness that we see both in the United States and more globally. Thank you.
Great. Dr. Kretsedemas?
Yeah, sure. I'll say a few words, and perhaps we'll layer in more as the conversation goes on. But the main point I wanted to begin with, and there's a lot to dig into in terms of the analysis of anti-Blackness that won't have time to build into these opening comments. But just beginning with I guess an overarching point that I want to use to link to the current policy context, which is that looking at the Black experience of migration, like you do have to go back to slavery. And of course, slavery wasn't really, even legally defined as the same as migration. It really was treated as separate, and even working through that's really important, to understand. But clearly, obviously, slavery doesn't really bring to mind the question of a problem of open borders, the need for open borders. People are being forcibly imported, right? And even though there is a problem of confinement, in the Black experience, like being confined to carceral spaces, I mean, there also is this experience of oppressive hypermobility, not being allowed to put down roots anywhere, like always being displaced, like always having to, move, from one place to the other. Like, if you think about, the history of the Great Migration, right, of Blacks, from the South to the northern cities, in the, in like the late Jim Crow era, is a good example of that. So overarching point, which I think we can take from the Black experience to even understand modern migration, is that there's a lot more forced migration going on even today, than we want to acknowledge, and that for a lot of people, the problem isn't just simply, that they can't get in, but they're not allowed to stay. And there's at least two types of displacements that, it's important to problematize, which, are the displacements that explain why people are moving to begin with. I mean, I won't get into my personal biography, because I come from, migrant families on the Jamaican and Greek side of my family, and they both are regarded as conventional migrants, but you sort of scratch the surface of those stories, and they're fleeing different types of, we'll say, precarities and pressures, in some cases war, in some cases, just, severe economic downturns that actually are shaped by global politics, but there's pressures leading people to move. And then once they get here, of course, with, deportation and detention, they can be displaced again. And so that's why, I noted that, Bilal and Jaya both, sort of signal the importance of building community, the right to remain. And that's also what I'm kind of underscoring as well, that that's a connecting link between the critique of displacement, the original displacement, being forced to leave from homeland, and also being forced to leave from, say, the global north, as two ways of, two issues that become more clear as important issues if you use a Black migration experience as a lens. So I'll leave it at that. But there's a lot more to say as to why anti-Blackness is foundational, because I have to say that initially, I mean, it took me a long time to get to a real embrace of the anti-Black analysis. Like I understood, there's racism, and that, people, Black, I'm Black, there's Black populations like suffer racism, but, I know that sometimes there's pushback against aspects of the anti-Black analysis. And I'll note that, our analysis is partly, for me at least, pretty, significantly informed by Afro-pessimism, which can be a divisive, body of argument, like out there. People sometimes feel like, okay, well, you're saying like Black people they're suffering more, and maybe perhaps, are being elevated on a pedestal, above other populations. I'll just say briefly, and I won't really have time to sort of unpack this right now, that what I really came to understand is that it's not about saying one population has it worse than the others, but there is something about the role that anti-Blackness played in the formation of say, the modern imaginary, which is more or less ontological and just objective to the entire social structure. And this actually didn't become apparent to me until I really took a close look at just the history, even just of U.S. refugee policy. I'll spare the examples now, but we do give a pretty good example in the beginning of the book just about like the history of the Alien and Seditions Acts, and how Thomas Jefferson, was the champion of civil rights, of civil liberties, for migrants and, and white citizens, and also was, a slave owner, obviously. But not only that, but actually privately was for a deportation regime that targeted blacks. Like he was, he was a founder of the American Colonization Society, which actually was this black deportation, privately funded network of white elites all throughout the U.S. Right, and just the ability of him to have both positions, be for civil liberties, against the crackdown of the centralization of federalist authority, and at the same time being specifically for deportation of blacks, just tells you a lot about the role that anti-blackness played, and like as this unquestioned common sense. And I'll leave it at that because I know I've gone on a little longer than I expected. But thanks.
No, thank you. And I think plenty of contemporary parallels to that point. So I will turn it over to Dr. Jackson.
Yes, thank you so much, Jaya and Philip and Jamela and the Acacia team for the invitation. This is such an honor to be on this panel, to share this stage with you all, but also to have an opportunity to pause all of my dean responsibilities and to really dig into this wonderful work that you have produced. It really is a breath of fresh air, and such an important text with the intervention that it makes into not only the immigration literature and the Black migration scholarship, but also how it intervenes into how we think of Black diaspora studies, African American studies, and all of these overlapping fields. And so I have so many thoughts and lots of things that I'd like to discuss and chime in on. Especially, I really appreciated the way that this work disrupted some silences and failures by not keeping anti-Blackness and Blackness central in our analytic frames. The conversation that I really appreciated was the way that it challenges this distinction between voluntary and involuntary migrants, political versus economic migrants. I mean, all of these binaries that have been used historically in US immigration policy to systematically exclude Black peoples. And but what I think I want to spend most of my time, my few minutes, throwing out there is the impact on anti-Blackness and Black immigrant identities and intraracial relations. And here I'm talking about relationships among Black peoples and among people of color, and how this impacts political organizing and how it limits progressive politics. And I can think of so many examples of how, what in one time in the literature was referred to as social distancing before the pandemic, when social distancing took on a different meaning, right? This was this long conversation about all of the conflict between Black immigrants and native-born African Americans that was predicated on this idea that Black immigrants somehow represented or occupied this privileged slot, right? That they were somehow better than African Americans, that they were more like immigrants, the model minorities, than they were like African Americans, which were the undeserving poor, which who were part of the truly disadvantaged in William Julius Wilson's terms, right? But this idea that they were somehow different, and not just acknowledging their cultural and national differences, but in terms of these hierarchies of superiority and inferiority, that African Americans were somehow inferior. And some of the conditions that Black immigrants met when they migrated to the United States and settled in American cities were not the result of structural factors, right? But were individual failures and cultural failures, and not connecting those dots to the global and structural anti-Blackness that had disinvestment led to disinvestment in Black neighborhoods, and also a devaluing of African-American and Black institutions. And I think this is important. You know, I think that just because we're talking about identity in the face of the confluence of immigration and criminal justice or mass incarceration, that we really do need to think about how these narratives worked on an individual level and what the implications were for coalitions among Black people and among working class people or people of color, and how they really did frustrate those alliances. A lot of my work is focused on Haitian immigrants in Boston and Haitian immigrants post-1965. And it's amazing how common it is to hear the phrase from scholars that I respect, right, who describe or rationalize the positions that Haitian immigrants took when they first arrived to the United States as not wanting to be Black twice, right? And how, I mean, it's amazing how common it is to hear a version of that or this comment that does not see the irony or the paradox, right, with what that means for Haitian immigrants to adopt this posture or to defend their sense of Haitianness or nationalism again with that argument. And I can think of in the case of Haitians in Boston, how in the early days of before the community really grew to its current size and influence, when there was a lot of talk that Haitian immigrants were just like the Irish and Italians, right? Again, this kind of discursive move that led to them being separate from African Americans, not only ideologically, but in different neighborhoods, pursuing different political projects, and not coalescing, not coming together on some very important issues until it became clear through mass deportation of Haitians and when Haitian immigrants, second generation and third generation Haitian immigrants started to really feel the effects of mass incarceration. When those could, then they turned to think about how some of these challenges impact our communities. And I think we see this now on a national scale, right? The discussion about reparations and how that has tried to separate, descendants of US slaves from everyone else who suffered under Jim Crow and loss of wealth and disinvestment and things like that. That somehow, as Philip mentioned, that there's this hierarchy of suffering that needs to be repaired, and not this sort of, this more of a coalition building across to see how the challenges that one group faces really do speak to the challenges of all people of color and our society more broadly. And so I will stop there. That was 5 minutes to throw out some half ideas that I had in my head, but I do hope that we're able to think about how identity limits some of the political projects that I think Black immigrants were in a prime position to take on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for that excellent contribution, and kind of links back to the theme from the book that progress is conceived of as progress towards whiteness, right? The progress narrative is about progressing towards whiteness, and that's something that we have to obviously dismantle. So in hope that Guerline will join us soon, I'm going to hand it over to Haddy next.
Thank you so much, Jaya, and thank you to the entire Acacia team, for the gracious welcome. And I'm just, really happy to be in community with all of you and to share this space with my awesome co-panelist. As it was said earlier, I serve as the Policy and Advocacy Director for the UndocuBlack Network, and we are essentially a network of currently and formerly undocumented Black migrants from across the country. And our work centers the needs of Black immigrants. And we do this by, similar to, some of the things that my co-panelists have said, in particular, centering the experiences of Black migrants, literally fighting against, this culture of sort of the erasure of Black migrants, and also advocating for and more often than not these days against policies that impact Black migrants. I think what is a bit unique about our work is that we tend to take a really holistic approach to the work, and we ground everything from a wellness framework. We all know as Black folks that, we were not put on this earth simply to just survive. Our people want to live full lives, right? And unfortunately, as Black folks in the US, acquiring papers or changing status or, meeting whatever the technical requirements are for quote unquote Americanness or doing immigration the right way is simply not enough to guarantee you, still safe, happy life in this country. Many of us have seen the news coverage lately around the migrant crises in cities like New York, where there have been plenty of Black migrants who've been bussed up there. And these reports, often lack any sort of nuance or context. They're often rooted in, the stereotypical fear-mongering, invasion, replacement theory type stuff. And for me, as a Black immigrant myself, I think I often think of the anti-Blackness, the colonialism, the militarism that contributes to the uprooting of these folks from their home countries into the US. Because these phenomena aren't happening in, some sort of vacuum. It's happening here in the US, but also I think similarly, we're seeing these migration patterns from a lot of sub-Saharan African countries in particular to European countries. And I think I also, in working with these migrant populations, think about the concept of home a lot and belonging. I think in the immigrants' rights movement, we tend to lean on that a lot. This idea that, we belong here. We've had and still have many immigration campaigns that use the word home. Like I remember, we are home, home is here, and what that means. But I think for many migrants, this idea of also not being able to fully settle in the US for the multitude of reasons, and also not being able to return home and come back freely, if you will, is its own type of violence. And, so I think that's another thing where even within the context of when we talk about Gaza, even pre-genocide, or conflict happening now, and we talk about this idea of an open air prison, I think of many Black migrants in this country who come here, are often relegated to specific parts of town, oftentimes over-policed, constantly having to dodge the traps of, the crimmigration system, as was mentioned earlier, often living in abject poverty, and not having the right of movement, even within certain states, even within certain cities, and certainly oftentimes not in and out of the country. And what does that also do to a person, right? What does that, being in that constant state of longing potentially to be home, or but having to be physically and to some extent mentally, systemically stuck in an area do? I also think when we talk about migration policy, we talk about it from the perspective of protecting, usually, at least these days, lots of newly arrived folks, right? There's been lots of, again, policy proposals around swift deportations, gutting the asylum system, and this idea of protecting people from being deported. Again, looking at this idea that when someone migrates, their ultimate goal is to just stay put where they are. And I think what's been interesting about this discussion and some themes in the book is this idea that that's not the end all be all, that there's something to be said about just the freedom of being able to move wherever. And I think for me, in my own experience, I see oftentimes the Black migrants who are said to have maybe made it because they are they've arrived in the US, they've been able to settle for decades. We romanticize these ideas of small enclaves, like a little Senegal in Harlem and things like that. But it's like, there's a reason why that is there. And as beautiful as those places are, oftentimes they're built out of this necessity because people are not able to just freely move. I think I also think about just the day-to-day reality of most people who, like I said, have been seen as having made it, but literally cannot move anywhere, or both literally and figuratively speaking, like move within systems, move socioeconomically. And at least for me in my work, thinking of things this way helps ground my approach to advocacy work for our community. This doesn't justify it, but I think it also helps, at least for me, make sense of a lot of what even newly arrived migrants are facing, right? They're often detained for longer periods of time than their non-Black counterparts. They have higher bond amounts. They're disproportionately placed in solitary confinement. It makes sense why cities like New York will suddenly say they have zero resources to support folks. And I think now more than ever before, we're seeing it very clearly that, this racism and anti-Blackness are a core tenet of this country's immigration system. It's not like it's this unintended consequence or an issue of a few bad ICE officers, but it's really at the core of how this system is designed to work. And so when we see new immigration policy proposals from either side of the political spectrum, we can be sure that Black migrants are likely going to bear the heaviest brunt of those harmful policies. And in the rare case that they are positive policies, which seems to just not happen these days, Black migrants tend to benefit the least from those policies. And so, if you'll, I don't know where I'm at with time, but if you'll allow me to be vulnerable for just a sec, I'll say that as a Black immigrant Muslim woman working in this space, it can oftentimes be exhausting at best and outright heart-wrenching at worst. Just in the last few weeks, I'll say we've seen both Republicans and Democrats support a horrific supplemental package that would have funded a genocide while also gutting the asylum system and effectively closing the border. And while my colleagues and I in the general immigrants' rights movement were scrambling to deal with this package and stop this bill from passing, my Black colleagues and I were also dealing with reports of the death of a Senegalese migrant in a detention facility in Louisiana. Luckily, he ended up, there was a mixture in the report and he ended up not dying. He's still in critical condition in the hospital as we speak. But I don't know many other policy wonks in DC that have to both worry about what's happening on Capitol Hill, worry about what the administration is doing, as well as worry about how they're going to pay or plan funerals or repatriate bodies, right? Or comfort the families of deceased people. But I know for me, and I don't know when Guerline will join, this is bizarrely enough, like a fairly regular part of our work, unfortunately. You know, and I share that to say that when it comes to migration policy, and doing this work for and as a Black immigrant myself, it looks very different, right, than what I think folks who are just doing quote unquote regular migration policy have to experience. So, you know, as we're in this crazy election year and as we're bracing ourselves for what's to come, and I mean, God only knows, because it's already pretty awful. I can honestly say that in doing my work, advocating for Black communities and as a Black immigrant, I'm often enraged, sometimes sad, often anxious. But I will say that I'm also deeply optimistic in the sense that it's heartening to see that we are having these conversations. I remember just a few years ago where even just naming the thing, like being like, hey, this is like totally anti-Black. Can we just all say that? Was like an uncomfortable conversation we had to have. I remember those early days of the Biden administration, where Biden had put out this lovely list of executive orders, but like 2 days later, we're still having deportation flights of pregnant Haitian women. And that continued, I think, for day after day, several months into the administration. I remember actually having Guerline on these calls, literally sobbing, and me frustrated, like, this is the same moment as the children in cages moment. Why is no one freaking out? And I mean, I think that the obvious reason is the anti-Blackness is just there. And so when I say that, it gives me at least a teeny tiny little bit of hope. I tend to be pessimistic these days, but I will say it is nice to at least just be having the conversation. And I look forward to having more of these conversations, even outside of Black History Month. So I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Haddy. Guerline, do you want to go next, or you want to have a little bit of a breather? We can also, Janay hasn't spoken yet either, so we can, whatever you prefer.
Yeah, I can go after Janay. My apologies. Traveling distractions and yeah, but I'm glad to be here.
The administration's keeping you busy. Janay, do you want to go next?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. This conversation is so deep and it's painful at the same time. I think about when I was a young child, I played in the play Rosa Parks. And I thought that was just a play, because remember Rosa Parks had to get to the back of the bus and she refused and they arrested her. I would never think, fast forward in 2024, we're still dealing with this racism, oppression against Black people. As far as Black migration goes, I'm very scared with this whole election coming in place. Biden pried on the same tactics that Trump did. Title 42 still exists. I never forget the day that I watched on the news, white suppressors on horses beating Haitian people with whips. And to hear the president say that needs to be investigated, what is there to investigate? If the roles were reversed and that was Ukraine, forget about it. It would have never happened. They would have put them under the jail. As a person that was born to a Jamaican dad who's also a victim of a broken immigration system, he came here with his green card, but the laws changed. He got in trouble as a teenager. And now he's in his 70s. He still can't have any status. So he has to still live in the darkness. At Families for Freedom, this organization is my heart. I came here in 2005 seeking help for my former spouse, who's also the father of my children. He was detained based on a conviction, a drug conviction, a nonviolent drug conviction. He got caught in the state of Virginia. They gave him 33 years for a non-violent drug conviction at the age of 18 years old. When he told me that, I was like, what? I had to do my investigation because I'm like, 33 years, you got to be a serial killer. I didn't know immigration laws run retroactive. And it's really sad how they treat people. There's no pathway to citizenship. White oppressors are allowed to traffic people across state lines, drop them off with no direction. This makes me very happy that I chose the life of being an activist, because just because something is law, I'm not going to go for it. Slavery was once legal. And they tell us, oh, it's the law, it's the law, it's the law. We had meetings about 2 weeks ago, how they trying to bring genocide back. It's like we have no hope. I'm a part of IJA, and we're trying to push for a new way forward. We have to create a new way forward. We have to let them know that we're gonna stand up for the people that can't speak for themselves. They don't have a voice. We can use our citizenship as a voice for them. We have migrants coming into this office daily to collect coats and things of that nature. Some of them don't even speak English. We have a language hotline where we can translate things to them, information, provide them with resources. I have a social services background because I did work for New York City Human Resources, AKA public assistance. And some of them are pregnant and they don't know that they're entitled to WIC and different benefits. And I let them know that I'm here to help. And I will even go with them to the appointments. Then they create this bad immigrant, good immigrant narrative. I worked as a director for New York City Department of Homeless Services. The immigrant community is like 5% of the shelter system. Most of the people in the shelter are United States citizens, but leave it up to the news, the migrants is taking all our resources, and that's not true. Because you see Mayor Adams came up with this $1 billion initiative where he's giving people cards. But why couldn't he do this months ago when they was first getting here? Where did this money come from? This is really deep. I'm thinking about a mother. She's from the Ivory Coast. She's a mom of 6. Her spouse is a US citizen. He left her with the 6 children. I tried to convince her to go into shelter. I didn't know the quote unquote migrant crisis was gonna come. None of us knew. She thought she can manage by herself. Once her landlord saw the husband wasn't there, he started to make sexual advances and things of that nature towards her. She was very uncomfortable. So she was able to enter the shelter safely with her children, but the conditions, I wouldn't even allow my dog to stay there. It was roaches and mice, vermin. And she didn't say anything. She called me crying and said she's just gonna clean it up. I said, absolutely not. I called New York City Department of Homeless Coalition and made sure they changed her room. This room they put her in just had roaches. And then when I'm speaking, they don't know, I know the different channels. So they was treating me like I'm a quote, undocumented immigrant that don't know my rights. I threatened to call the news for them to finally place this woman in a safe space. And I can just imagine how many other migrants are in these shelter rooms that's inhumane and they scared to speak up because they just want to have a place to stay. So organizations like Families for Freedom, Haitian Bridge Alliance, and all of you on the call, we're making a big difference in this world. And we need to keep this going, not just for Black History Month. And I always stress immigrant rights are human rights. People should be able to make home wherever they lay their hat. Because I travel to different countries. I've been to Haiti to visit, but I will be scared to live there. They don't have medical treatment unless you have big, big money. And most of the people are impoverished. When Gene was deported to Haiti, unfortunately, he was able to come back in 2021 because of the pardon I filed. He had a heart attack within 6 weeks of being back, right in my living room. If he would have had that heart attack in Haiti, he would have been dead. They don't have these resources and they don't look at the impact it plays on society. Our children we're raising them in these environments and they're seeing how people are being treated and it's wrong. I know we have time. Oh, So that's my 2 cents, and I look forward to the Q&A. Guerline, you can take the floor.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you so much, beloved. I really appreciate your sharing. And again, I apologize for being late, got caught in transit. But I did hear a lot of what Haddy was saying, and I think we can, after Haddy and Janay, we can close, and I don't have to say anything else. But really centering the fact that what you have heard is really what is happening, not only at the US-Mexico border, but inside of the US, when we are dealing with Black communities with immigration, when we are dealing with the pipeline from the border to school, from school to prison, from prison to deportation. And when we are still looking at how currently 1 out of every 10 Black people, Black person in the United States is an immigrant, like Haddy and myself. And when we go down to 1 out of every 4 is a child of immigrant, one parent being a Black immigrant. So that is what we are looking at. So understanding the power and the strength that we as a community carry, and understanding also why it is necessary for us to make sure that we address immigration, as we say, as a Black issue, as a human right issue, as a social issue. And as we continue to work collectively, we have literally a handful of Black-led organizations that are focusing on people of African descent within this vast sea of immigrant organizations and advocates and all of that. Yet there's still only a handful, right? If I can say names and count by name, on my hand, is Haitian Alliance, UndocuBlack, Budget, it's Families for Freedom, right? It's Farm in Miami. But when we are really understanding is, where are we? And how are we centering Black lives every day of the year? And that's why when Bilal contacted me, I said, yeah, this is an amazing talk, and looking also into the book and the work that's being done at the center, is how do we continue to make sure we highlight, and we don't just check our Black a box during Black History Month, but we partner in this struggle. We partner in this work, and really understanding the need for that. Because Haddy mentioned this one person from Senegal who is currently in critical conditions. But what I haven't shared with her is that 2 days ago, we had another death from Jamaica. The day before that, it was from Guinea. The day before that, it was from Haiti, all at the US-Mexico border. Where I am headquartered in San Diego, we started receiving people in October of last year. 60% of them are people of African descent. Everything that's happening in the Congo right now are forcing people to flee, making a journey to the border. And nobody's talking about the Congo. Nobody's talking about Guinea. And Haiti, everybody has Haiti fatigue, not understanding that what we are dealing with in Haiti is a direct result of US foreign policies. And we are talking about people not able to feed themselves. But when you talk to them, they just tell you, well, we might have to leave because we cannot eat, but they don't even understand themselves the root cause of why they have to flee. That can be directly connected to the climate crisis. That can be directly connected with gang violence and political turmoils. But when we talk about those issues, I think it is critical that we center that in the fact that every single system that we end up being a part of is rooted in anti-Black racism. So how do we operate within a system that is rooted in anti-Black racism and at the same time try to fight that same system, right? As Haddy mentioned, when we come together to discuss those issues, it is not just, hey, we have the Senate bill, but it is also how do we make sure as we are pushing for those policies, understanding there is no safe space for Black people. There's no safe space for Black people as they get to the Darien in Panama, as they get to Mexico, as they get to Colombia or Chile. That is the reality. And I think on top of all of that is understanding anti-Black racism and anti-Black prejudice is a global phenomenon. It's the same thing we are witnessing happening of the shores of Spain, right? Or Morocco. It's the same thing we are seeing how the British are pushing back the former people they have colonized. Now let's take a look at colonization and as to where we are right now. Understanding that the same mechanism that have been used to enslave and colonize people is the same mechanism that continues to be in effect today. And the countries, the sending countries, whether it is Senegal or Mauritania or Haiti or Cameroon, we have to take a deep look as to where are we going. We are fleeing a system that was created by the former colonizers, making it impossible for us to stay at home, to thrive and be safe. And we make those dangerous journeys to the Darien, to the seas, to the Mediterranean seas, right? Only to be turned back from the same people who have literally taken everything from us, force us to flee to them, and for them to close their doors and say, we don't want you. In 2024, when the United States continues to deport people to Senegal, to Mauritania, to Haiti, to all those countries. So I think that we really need to put those things into context and center that as we study to make sure that when we step into a place that Haddy and myself and Janay might not be present, that those realities are expressed and explained. And if you get in a room and you look around, none of us are there, make sure that the next one we are included. And so that we can bring the people we meet every day at the border, or in Brooklyn, or in DC, in Chicago. The big discourse that we are seeing right now within the Black community is the fact that migration and immigration has never been seen as a Black issue. When we have people from Africa, from the Caribbean, ending up in the streets of New York or Chicago, and then integrating into those communities that have become our communities, except that we are still not being seen. And we see the scarcity mentality is once again being put at play, where we have underserved Black communities, underserved communities now fighting newly arrived immigrants, because we see the newly arrived immigrants as those who are coming to take from us, to take from our food, to take from our jobs, to take from everything, right? But at the same time, while we are fighting for the little crumbs that came from not even the baked cake, while they are putting the ingredients together, you know, the little flour that's still on the board, we are fighting for the little flour that's still on the board, but we don't see the baked cake that is intact, that we should be having a part of. But because we are so busy, so hungry, so frustrated in our own situations, we fight ourselves. So we need to find a way to change the narratives, to redirect our efforts in making sure we center where we need to fight for justice, and really, for lack of a better word, dismantle that system that was created to continue to enslave, colonized, and literally kill people of color, but specifically Black people. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gathleen. You know, even though you weren't able to join us a little later, your comments really reflected so many themes of the book. So thank you for that. I think that we're going to invite Shana Aber, who's the Executive Director of the Acacia Center for Justice. She had a comment that maybe we could hear directly from her rather than me repeating it.
Yeah, I just invited her to join. Until then, maybe we could take another question in the chat. Oh, here's Shana.
Hi all, sorry, my computer was doing something. I wanted to thank you all for this really amazing, I think, compelling discussion. My comment or question, I'd love reflections from the panelists, is really about, you know, I'm thinking about two pieces that I've recently read and listened to. One, I'm sure you all have read, Cast by Isabel Wilkerson, where she talks about, you know, basically, very briefly, actually, given her background, you'd think she would have talked about it more, but she talks about the Black immigrant experience and contrasts it with the Black experience and how people try at first to distance themselves from Black Americans, or to not be lumped in with Black Americans when they get to this country, because of, you know, hearing and being able to pick up in all of the media and all of the discourse, the way that Black people are talked about as disposable, right? And they don't want to be affiliated with that kind of disposability. And then the second thing that's occurring to me is this podcast I recently listened to, is Vox the Weeds podcast on Blackness and health outcomes. And one of the startling facts that was brought up by the medical doctor who was on that podcast was that when Black immigrants first arrive in the country, their health outcomes tend to be actually on par with white Americans. And then in 2 generations, you can see that the health outcomes of their descendants have actually degraded to that of Black Americans. And what does that say? In my view, I mean, it was startling, and also, of course, right? What does that say about the way we in our country treat Black people, and what it does to us, how it corrodes even our health, our epigenetics, what happens as you are experiencing the levels of racism and oppression and disposability, and these constant messages of unworthiness to people who are either forced to migrate here as trafficking victims generations ago in order to labor in fields, or who were forced to come here because the opportunities and stability in their points of origin were not allowing them to live with dignity. And also, one more thing that comes to mind is this famous quote by Dr. Martin Luther King that I think, you know, really resonates with this discussion and needs to be lifted up in Black communities, both in, you know, the multi-generational Black communities and the newly arrived Black immigrant communities. But, you know, we may have come here on different ships, but we're in the same boat now. And that should be our organizing principle. I really, really am thankful for this discussion.
Thanks so much, Shana. Before opening it up to, I want to hear what the panelists have to say about that, but I just wanted to add in, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A that I think relate to Shana's first point, and actually to what Dr. Jackson said in her introductory comments. So one said, I'm curious about the speaker's thoughts on Black migrants and their relationship with African Americans. It seems to be a point of contention and there is no unity in my experience within these communities. It seems extremely frustrating. How can we continue to bridge the gap and create mutual support and solidarity? And then there's another question that says, lately, there are many conversations from Black American organizations that see immigrants as a block to their progress. How do we deal with this? So I will just throw that open. Guerline, it looks like you might want to jump in.
Yes, I would like to say something. And, you know, the reality is, at least from my experience, is for Black immigrants, once we come to the US, we become Black America. And it is not until lately that we talk about immigration as a Black issue or Black immigrant, that Black immigrants starts to speak of their ethnicity or their country of origin. So when we talk about politics in America, and we look at someone like Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman who dared to not only fight and became candidate for president, but also became the first Black woman in Congress. What we don't know, she never came and spoke about her being an immigrant from the Caribbean. So we never talk about the immigrant portion of Black immigrants in America. Malcolm X, he never came and spoke on behalf of his parents who were immigrants from the Caribbean, right? Carl Michaels, and we can even go to Cicely Tyson. Every society in America, from Hollywood to politics, and I say from Hollywood to politics for very various reasons, right? Or for Chicago, who was really founded by produced by Haitian men. When we come to the US, once we are here, we are Black America. And at that time, a lot of it were not seen in the view of an immigration lens. But now that immigration has become the key component for all debate, and immigration will be a leading factor in these upcoming elections. And now we have a handful of Black-led organizations that are shining lights on immigration, right? And the impact of that, because of the mass deportations, because of finally September 11, 2021, finally allowed people to see the reality at the border when people on horseback whipping Black folks. Now it becomes a thing. But I wanted to share for the person who asked about the Black immigrants and African Americans, is the fact that once we are here, we become African Americans unless it is absolutely necessary for us to be an immigrant. And I know a lot of folks will share a lot of other points, but I wanted to kind of center that in the reality that this is who we are. Right. You know, I came here and I automatically became a part of Black America. My first realization of anti-Black racism was Abner Wima in New York, when he was brutally abused. And I looked at him on that bed and he looked like he was about to die. That is the first realization that I was a Black person in America, and this could have been me, but it still wasn't as an immigrant. It was as a Black woman in America. Our immigration status is never really at the forefront of whatever discussion it is. And that is why now, with the discord within our community, we must try to find a way to fight that. Thank you so much.
Yeah. And, you know, Guerline and Shayna, who was it who asked the question in the chat, right? About the health disparities and some of the similarities and things like that. I think people often forget that immigration is a civil rights issue, is a human rights issue. But when we think about the civil rights legislation, 1964, 1965, we also have 1968, right, with the Hart-Celler Act. And that is the legislation that really diversified the stream of immigrants to the United States. And that's where you see so many people of color, Black folks from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, really transforming the modern wave of immigration that we are still in today. And yet there's a way that these challenges and these issues that we are confronted with today in such stark relief, none of them are new. And I just want to borrow from some framing comments that the co-editors of the book made for this forum. And I'm actually going to read from the document that you shared to get us moving for today. And you write an analogy about think of a house that's built on top of a sinkhole. The people on the bottom floor of the house are more at risk of falling into the sinkhole, and they see the foundation of the house crumbling around them. The people on the upper floors of the house may not feel the same sense of urgency to address the problem, and they may feel comforted by the fact that they're in a somewhat better position. But they're ignoring the fact that when the foundation finally gives way, everyone's falling into the hole. Right? It's this sense of linked fate that that Dawson writes about in his work, right? This sense that where Guerline talks about redirecting our efforts and shifting our focus, that's precisely, I think, what needs to happen. And I think the health disparities example is a great one, how we see the shift in people's mental health and their physical health as a result of, you know, what is supposed to be this progressive move, right? This move that's supposed to better their lives from their countries of origin to the United States. I've done some research on wealth disparities, especially in the city of Boston, where the inequality is just, you know, is just ridiculous, and so is the cost of living. But a few years ago, one of the findings that got a lot of headlines was the fact that Black communities had $8 of wealth. African-American communities in Boston had $8 of wealth, and there was this comparison with Caribbean immigrants that had where their wealth disparity, well, the disparity between Caribbean immigrants and white Bostonians was less, right? The Caribbean immigrants actually had some wealth that Black Americans in that metropolitan area did not have. But I think what we always forget is that, you know, it is this fighting for crumbs off the table and not being able to access that cake that that Guerline mentioned, right? It's the scraps and trying to best each other in these races when we're not realizing that there is a really failed project when we're not partnering with each other and building coalitions.
Thanks, Dr. Jackson. Yeah, I was also going to add, I'm so glad that you mentioned just like this, at least like the political structures and fighting for certain pieces of immigration reform were very interlinked to the civil rights movement. And even earlier than that, you know, I often like to remind folks, and I think several other people, I see Brianne's on this call somewhere, and Brianne speaks much more eloquently about this than I do, just even the concept of citizenship as, something that could be attained by anyone who is other than white men in this country is very much something that Black folks in this country, people who are descendants of enslaved people, fought for and won. And so even within the immigrants' rights movement, when we have certain campaigns around citizenship for all, or, green cards or whatever for all 11 million of us, that is a derivative of like a something that Black folks in this country fought for and won. And I think since then, though, there has kind of also been this divergence of even Black politicians seeing immigration as an issue that they can take ownership of, namely like the Congressional Black Caucus. More often than not, there has to be a lot of convincing and pushing and pulling to, get the caucus to take up an immigration policy or an immigration issue as something that is their own, as opposed to something like voters' rights or certain criminal justice reform things. And similarly, our partners in the movement and in the political space who champion immigration issues also often don't see it as a Black issue, like the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Just a few weeks ago, when the supplemental bill that I mentioned earlier was, I think the bill text was revealed, there was obviously folks were very upset, rightfully so. I think the chairperson of the Congressional Black Caucus put out a statement saying something, I'm going to paraphrase, but alluding to complaining, and rightfully so, very valid, that this was a closed door negotiation and that the CHC was not involved. And the example she gave was that, that it's outrageous that the CHC would not have been involved. That's as if they had like a criminal justice reform bill and the CBC was not involved. And I read this and I'm like, what are you? First of all, yes, but the CHC should also be involved in criminal justice reform bills, just like the CBC should be involved in immigration related bills. I'm sitting here like staring and just horrified as a Black immigrant myself, because it's very clear that even, at the very top of like these decision-making apparatuses, these people with all this power, just the framing around who has quote unquote ownership of these issues, we still have a very long way to go. When you look at statements that are made from the Congressional Black Caucus about immigration related issues, it's oftentimes written in the voice of like allyship and support. It's like there's still a lot of work just for them for those spaces, for them to feel that immigration is in fact a Black issue, and it's okay for them to take ownership of the issue as such.
Thank you. So it is hard to believe because there's so much more to say, but we're getting close to the end of our time. So I actually just wanted to open it up to our two co-editors to see if you both wanted to make offer any closing comments to the participants.
I can say a few. Oh, Phil, did you want to? Okay.
No, go ahead.
Okay, I'm so glad that we're having this conversation, and it makes me think in my position as a scholar, I just want to say that, Dr. Jackson, you made this point about the way that Black immigrants are positioned as not wanting to be Black twice, which kind of erases really this kind of conversation that Black migrants are Black and migrant, and they have concerns that address both of these things. And I feel that very deeply as a child of Jamaican migrants who are also concerned about issues around being Black and navigating the policing violence in the streets, as well as, immigration and the concerns that come with family reunification, for example. And more just kind of my own personal frustration is that as scholars, we need to be having these conversations. I'm so encouraged by the work of these organizers and activists doing the kind of work that we in the academic sphere, I think, are beginning to do, but I think we can and should do more. And so I just want to throw that out there, as I'm just so glad that this conversation is happening, and may this not be the end. Thank you.
Yeah, also happy for this not to be the end as well. And there's so much to say, but so I'll try, I mean, I will be brief just by necessity, but I mean, one thing I'll just note that just in my own attempt at looking at the issues, and I do have my own kind of personal experience with some of this stuff. Like I was in New York, when the Admiral Louinema incident happened. I recall, maybe I'm remembering incorrectly, but I recall actually it really was an issue for the Haitian community, and even in the news there was commentary about how even other Caribbean communities didn't come around it. I mean, I grew up in South Florida, from a migrant background, but also maybe just growing up as just someone who's Black in the U.S. And there are a lot of tensions between the Haitian community, African American community, the Latinx community, which are just tied, partly to the political economy of South Florida, but also just these deeper racist issues. So I've seen all that, but I'd say that for me, as I've kind of, grown as a scholar, just analyzing this stuff, I see that there are these problems that really are iterations of much deeper cycles, and so for example, you'll see that in the 1960s, there wasn't so much an issue of, say, Black immigrants having a distinct identity, as many of you noted, like Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael. Lots of folks, who were sort of Black leaders actually had immigrant backgrounds. They didn't speak about it. Then pretty much, after, say, Hart-Celler Act, after the, in the post-civil rights era, you sort of have this new visibility around Black migrants, but they're sort of embraced in a way that actually distinguishes them from Blacks, right? And that's a whole new phenomenon, right? And I don't have time to explain it all now, but it becomes a whole new socio-political reality. But actually, what you're seeing is actually just a repetition of something that's always been repeating, which generally is that when people become accepted as migrants, they do get accepted on the condition that they are distanced from Blackness, and when they have solidarity with Black people, it becomes irrelevant that they're a migrant, which is also why, even though I don't mean to be kind of dispiriting by saying obviously we should be for people's freedom of mobility. The problem is that historically the freedom of mobility is a freedom of mobility of, just say in just simple crude terms, of the colonizer, and that people only can legitimately adopt that mobility if they are, if you can align them somehow with that history of privilege, which is why it becomes problematic, or even people who are Black have to be distanced from Blackness in order to be seen as, relatable migrants, right? So at some point you have to deal with that. And I'll end up by saying, I began this in academia, but it kind of is sort of fitting that I'm not in academia anymore, because actually it wasn't really totally logical, but the theories that we're working with, actually have more currency. Like Afro-pessimism in particular, in more activist circles in academia. It's sort of is historically sort of, it's been commented on. I won't say historically, but over the last 5-10 years. And I really come to see anti-Blackness as not entirely even rational. It's rational, but it's almost like a secular theology. If I go back to give you one final example that sort of stuck with me, that Haiti for the longest while is considered one of the poorest nations in the Western Hemisphere. But early on, it was actually, a lot of, early, American elites actually noted that, the natural resources in Haiti were unparalleled compared to many other parts of, of the Caribbean. The whole Haitian Revolution came to be because it was the wealthiest slave, it was the jewel of the, of the empire of slavery. It was the most profitable slave colony as well. And even shortly after the Haitian Revolution whatever came to fruition, there was a period of time in the early 1800s when segments of the U.S. economy began to freely trade with Haiti, and it very easily could have begun become a very important economic partner with the U.S. and and eventually, of course, the slave owning classes, but not just them. Just put an end to it. The whole point being is that it could be perfectly possible to have this thriving economy that actually benefited Blacks, even benefited whites, benefited Black migrants and also Blacks in the U.S. And all people. And yet, there was a deliberate decision not to choose that future, right? That the economic growth is going to happen in a way that doesn't include certain people, or which ensures that certain people don't have as much to say, and that is, so it's, and that to me is it's one part of the puzzle about what anti-Blackness is. I mean, it is like this commitment in principle to a certain kind of future, even if it means, jeopardizing, our own economic stability, right? Our own political stability. Like we're going to choose that future over another one. I mean, I'll end it there because there's so much more to say, but, thanks everybody for showing up.
There's clearly so much more to say. There are more questions we didn't get to. I'm sorry about that, but I just wanted to say an enormous thank you to the panelists for a really rich discussion that we could have continued for several hours. Thank you to all the participants for showing up for this conversation. I encourage all of you to check out this amazing book. Bilal has dropped the link in the chat, published by Temple University Press, I'm proud to say, Modern Migrations, Black Interrogations. And please follow Acacia on social media. Thank you so much.